Welcome. I hope you're blessed in the Lord today. In this video, we're going to continue to go through Matthew 5, 17 through 20, and we're going to focus in on verse 17. We're doing this in light of the fact that oftentimes we are confused in the Christian life thinking that the Old Testament was law and the New Testament is grace, when in reality, in the New Testament, we still have a law. We're not under the law of Moses, but we are under the law of Christ, as Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 21. But I want to start actually in verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1, and note something that Matthew is trying to explain to us. Now, seeing the crowds, he went up on a mountain, this speaking of Jesus, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began speaking and taught them, saying, and then he's going to begin this Sermon on the Mount. In the Old Testament, we see in the type and shadow that God came down to the mountain, and he spoke to Moses and the people of Israel the 10 commandments. And then he spoke to Moses, and Moses handed on the rest of the commandments that we find in the law of Moses. So what are we seeing here? What Matthew is showing us is that now God has become flesh, and he goes up on this mountain, and he sits down, and he begins to teach his law to his disciples. So we need to see that this is what is happening, that we are under law, but it's the fulfillment of the law of Moses. The law of Moses was like a shadow, like a type. It was just a picture of the righteous standards that God had. Now we see that Jesus fulfills the law in a couple different ways. One, he fulfills the sacrifices, the Passover. He becomes our circumcision because the old man is taken away and the new man has come. We see that he is our Sabbath rest. So we see in many ways his life, death, burial, and resurrection, they are the fulfillment of the Old Testament law, type, and shadow. But there's another sense in which he is the fulfillment. That his law, the commands that he gives, are the perfect expression of God's holy standards. And so we need to understand that the righteous requirements of the Old Testament law that were given in a shadow, they weren't completely clear, are fulfilled in the teaching of Jesus Christ. Particularly in Matthew 5 through 7, that's his point. But elsewhere, in everything that Jesus teaches, his word is our law. His character is our standard, and so that's what we go by. But let's go ahead and jump into verse 17 here. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. The first question we have to ask is, why on earth? Jesus has already started the sermon. He's already talked about the Beatitudes, being salt and light. And now he says, look, don't get confused by what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the law of God is to be done away with. Why would anybody assume that Jesus was contradicting and going against the law of Moses? Because of what he's going to continue on and say. If we jump over to verse 21, you have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be in danger of judgment. So we see he's quoting even the 10 commandments, the Old Testament law, and he's saying, you've heard this. He's going to say, verse 22, but I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without cause will be in danger of judgment. So people could get the impression that he's saying, oh, the law of Moses tells you this, but I'm telling you this. So this is really important for us to understand that what Jesus is saying is at some points going to seem very contradictory to the law of Moses. And the truth is, it's not he's contradicting the law of Moses, but if somebody obeys the law of Moses down to the letter and does everything allowed in the law of Moses, they will be contradicting his law, because his law is actually the standard. The law of Moses is not the standard. The law of God's only begotten Son is the standard. So let's consider a few examples of this. If we flip over to Leviticus chapter 19, and we look at verse 12, it will tell us this: you shall not swear falsely by my name, and so defile the name of your God. I am the Lord. So in the Old Testament, they were allowed to swear. They were allowed to swear oaths by the name of the Lord, but they weren't allowed to do it falsely to lie. For example, when it says, you shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. In other words, when you swear an oath, you can't swear an oath in the name of God and then actually you're lying about it. And so that was forbidden in the Old Testament. It wasn't forbidden to swear an oath. It was just forbidden to lie when you swore an oath. But Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33, again you have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not swear falsely, but shall fulfill your oaths to the Lord. So this is what was given as a command in the Old Testament. Don't swear falsely, but keep your oaths. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for this is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes mean yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these comes from the evil one. So if someone says, look, I'm not going to break the Old Testament law, I'm going to keep it. So I swear an oath, and when I swear that oath, I'm going to keep what I said. I'm going to fulfill my oath. But you know, if you do that, you are breaking the command of Jesus Christ. In fact, he says, for whatever is more than these comes from the evil one. So that's a very strong contradiction with the Old Testament law. This is why Jesus started off by saying, look, don't be confused. I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Because his teaching is going to fulfill it. If someone obeys Jesus' commands to always speak the truth, their yes is yes, their no is no, and they never swear because they don't have to, because they always speak the truth, are they contradicting or going against the Old Testament law? No, they're not. But if somebody goes back and obeys those commands or obeys what's allowed in the Old Testament law, and they swear an oath, they will be contradicting Jesus' law. So his law is greater. His law is the standard. The Old Testament is not the standard. The word of Jesus Christ is what we're going to be judged by. The word of Jesus Christ is the standard that we are to live by. So we need to know that he was, in a sense, contradicting the Old Testament because he was bringing something higher, that if you walked on the lower plane of the Old Testament law, you would be contradicting the law of the eternal King, the Christ, the Lord of all, the one that has all authority in heaven and on earth. Let's look at another example. If we flip over to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 through 3. It says this, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, then let him write her a bill of divorce and put it in her hand and send her out of her house. When she departs out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. If the second husband rejects her and writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the second husband who took her to be his wife dies, her first husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife, since she is defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you must not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So in the Old Testament law, if you wrote a certificate of divorce for your wife and she went away and married somebody else, then that was according to the law. It was okay. You could divorce your wife and she could marry another. But let's read what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. It was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Verse 31. Verse 32. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So if you write a certificate of divorce for your wife under the law, and she goes and marries another, she's not an adulteress. That is legal under the law. But here Jesus is saying, if you divorce her, write a certificate of divorce, she goes and marries another, she is an adulteress because she married somebody else when she's actually still your wife. So we see here that what Jesus is saying is higher standard than what the law of Moses was. So if you keep Jesus' standard, and you are married, and you stay married, and you don't get divorced, then you will be keeping the Old Testament law. You will be fulfilling the righteous requirements of the Old Testament law. But if you keep the Old Testament law, you will not be fulfilling the righteous requirements of the commands of Jesus Christ. So his law is higher, and it contradicts the old because it is the fulfillment of a type and a shadow. If we turn to Matthew chapter 19, Jesus says more about this. Starting in verse 1. Now when Jesus finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he heard them, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, tempting him, saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? He answered, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. They said to him, then why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He said to them, Moses, for the hardness of your heart, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So again, Jesus is clarifying. He says, well, why were they allowed to do this lower standard? Why are they allowed to live according to a lower standard than God initially required or he demanded from the beginning? Because of the hardness of their heart, he was dealing with Israel and giving them only a semblance of righteousness. He was giving them only a law that was a type and a shadow of the true law of Christ, because they didn't have the Spirit of God yet, and so they would immediately rebel against the righteous standards of Christ's law, and then they would be judged as a nation, and then Christ would not be able to come through that nation to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. We've covered this in a video. I'll try to put up a link to the video that we talked about the context of the Old Testament law and why it is that God compromised his standards in the Old Testament law. But here we see that those commands in the Old Testament were a compromise. But Jesus is bringing a law that is not compromised. So if you keep Jesus' commands, you will not break the Old Testament law of divorce and remarriage, because you will stay married and you will be faithful to your husband and to your wife. And you will not remarry after you've been divorced. It won't happen. You will stay faithful. But if you go back to the Old Testament law and do what was permitted under the Old Testament law, to divorce your wife, write her a certificate of divorce, and then she goes and marries somebody else, as it said in we're looking in Deuteronomy chapter 24, she goes and marries another, which is permitted under the law of Moses, then she would be an adulteress according to the law of Jesus Christ. So we need to be clear, there's the fulfillment of the law, which is the actual law, the law that God intends. When you read Psalm 119, and it talks about the perfection of God's law, it talks about the beauty of it, and it basically praises the law, it was not talking about the type and the shadow. Historically, it was talking about the Old Testament law, but that was only a type and a shadow, and it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we're now, as Christians, we can read Psalm 119 about the law of Jesus Christ, and we say, yes, it is a perfect law that converts the soul because it's beautiful and it's God's perfect righteous standard. So we need to understand that there was a semblance of righteousness in the Old Testament law, the standards of God, but they were not perfect standards. The perfect standard has been revealed in Jesus Christ. This is why he said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. I came to bring the perfection of it. Let's jump over to Leviticus, because this is one that people will often misunderstand. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Verse 18, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So he says here, who is the neighbor? The neighbor, according to the context of the law, was other Israelites. Do not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. So in the law of Moses, it was commanded that they could not bear a grudge or take vengeance on other Israelites. But that didn't mean that they couldn't kill the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites, and it didn't mean that. So the law in the Old Testament was love your neighbor, other Jews, as yourself. This is why the man tested Jesus when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, but who is my neighbor? And Jesus said, the Samaritan is your neighbor. Not only the Jew, but now Jesus has extended. And so we see here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So where in the law does it say to hate your enemy? It doesn't say it with those exact words, but it everywhere states it whenever God commands them to take vengeance on the idolaters. So he tells them, love your neighbor, meaning the other Israelites, but hate your enemy, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and anybody God commanded them to go and to slay. So Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, according to the law, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Okay, so what do we see here? We see that Jesus has now given us a command that fulfills the righteous requirement or the shadow and the type of the righteousness in the Old Testament law. To love your enemies even as you love yourself. To not take vengeance on your enemies, not on the Samaritans, not on the Romans, but to love them, to do good to them, to pray for them, to bless them. Even when they do evil to you, you return good to them. We don't take vengeance even on our enemies. And so if you obey the law of Christ, you will not break the law that says love your neighbor as yourself in the Old Testament applied only to Jews. But if you only keep the law according to the law of Moses in its context, and only love those that are other Jews besides you, then you will not fulfill the law of Jesus Christ, because you will hate others. According to the law, you were allowed to do that, but now in Jesus' law, you're not allowed to do that. So we need to see that he came to fulfill the law of Moses. So we need to see this. One more thing before we close up here. In Matthew chapter 15, let's go ahead and look there. Matthew chapter 15. Starting in verse 1 through 20. I won't read all the way through it. But basically, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, look, your disciples are not keeping the tradition of the elders. They're not washing their hands before they eat. Okay? So the Pharisees bring up the issue of the law of the elders, or the tradition of the elders. A lot of times in Matthew chapter 5 and through 7, what people will argue, particularly those in the Hebraic roots movement, will say, Jesus was not contradicting the law of Moses, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant law, when he was saying, you've heard it said, but I say to you. But instead, he'll say, that he was only contradicting the tradition of the elders that the Pharisees were teaching. Let me point this out here. We'll go into it more later. But the tradition of the elders was only mentioned in that passage, Matthew chapter 15. There's a parallel passage, I believe, in Mark. I can't remember what chapter it's in. But the Pharisees understood the difference between the tradition of the elders and the law of Moses. And so they brought it up. They brought it up to Jesus. They didn't say, why are you not keeping the law of Moses and your disciples are not washing their hands before they eat? No, they knew it was different. Okay? So when people from the Hebraic roots movement come to Matthew chapter 5 through 7, they can't have it say that Jesus is contradicting the Old Testament law, because their system is based on the fact that Jesus taught the law of Moses and taught us to obey all the commands taught in the law of Moses. So they say what he was actually contradicting was the traditions of the elders. But that traditions of the elders were not a thing that was commonly talked about in the Gospels. It was mentioned in that one place. They'll say, when they'll talk about the Sabbath, and the law of the elders, or the tradition of the elders, is not mentioned in those passages, only in the passage that I just referenced. One could say that he's referencing it in Matthew chapter 23, I believe, verse 4, but it's only a quick reference. It doesn't mention it. But we need to understand, when Jesus is talking in the Sermon on the Mount, he's saying, you've heard it said by the ancients. And then he quotes the Old Testament scriptures. And then he says, but I say to you. So the question we started with, why would Jesus say, do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The reason he had to say that is because what he was teaching is going to be a contradiction. Now, if you obey Jesus, that doesn't contradict the Old Testament law. You'll fulfill the Old Testament law. The righteous requirements of the law, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Those things will be fulfilled in anyone that obeys the law of Jesus Christ. But if you only obey the Old Testament law and you do everything that is allowed in the Old Testament law, you will be contradicting the law of Jesus Christ. So it is the fulfillment, it is the reality, and the Old Testament law is only a type and a shadow. He's not just contradicting the tradition of the elders. That's not what is being talked about anywhere in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. He's contradicting in the sense that he is raising the bar of the righteous standards of God that God always intended, like he said in Matthew chapter 19, that there would be one man, one woman, and it'd be marriage for life. And so we see that the law of Jesus Christ fulfills the Old Testament law, but it's not the same thing as the Old Testament law. If you walk according to the things permitted in the Old Testament law, you will be in disobedience to Jesus Christ, and you will not be walking in the righteousness of Christ. And you will, as we'll see later, you will not inherit the kingdom of God. So I hope this has been helpful to you. We'll continue to go through this passage and to get understanding step by step. Hope this has been helpful. God bless.